The crack of the whip was the first sound of disaster, a gunshot report that startled the slumbering dust of the Wyoming plains. The stagecoach, a lumbering beast of painted wood and worn leather, lurched violently. Inside, Clara May was thrown against the opposite seat, the hard edge of a valise digging into her ribs. Outside, a chorus of shouts erupted, guttural and menacing, punctuated by the thunder of galloping hooves. Robbers, the driver, bellowed, his voice thin with panic. Clara's father, Jonas May, a man whose courage had long since been eroded by failure and cheap whiskey, immediately clutched the money pouch hidden inside his coat. His eyes, small and fearful, darted around the coach's cramped interior, assessing the threat not to his daughter, but to his assets. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She scrambled to the window, peering through the billowing cloud of alkali dust. Masked riders, 4 of them, were closing in their horses, moving with the fluid grace of predators. One of them brandished a pistol, its silver plating catching the brutal midday sun. The world dissolved into chaos. A gunshot shattered the window beside Clara's head, showering her with glass. She flinched back, a cry catching in her throat. The stagecoach ground to a screeching, shuddering halt, its wheels digging into the soft earth. The doors were ripped open simultaneously. "Out, everybody, out now!" a voice snarled, laced with a cold authority that brooked no argument. Clara stumbled out into the blinding sunlight, her hands raised. The other passengers, a nervous-looking salesman and a stern-faced woman in black, followed suit, their faces pale with terror. Jonas was the last to emerge, his movements stiff and reluctant. The leader of the bandits, a tall man whose eyes were chips of cold granite above a dusty bandana, surveyed them with contempt. "Your valuables. Now." His men moved efficiently, stripping the passengers of their watches, rings, and wallets. When one of them reached Jonas, her father offered no resistance, meekly surrendering the money pouch he had guarded so jealously just moments before. He didn't even glance at Clara. Clara had little to offer. A few coins in her reticule, which she handed over without a word. Her gaze, however, was fixed on the leader. There was something in his posture, a cold, deliberate stillness that was more frightening than the waving guns of his men. His eyes scanned her, lingering for a moment on the delicate silver locket resting at the hollow of her throat. It was her most prized possession, the only thing she had left of her mother. The silver was worn smooth from years of her own anxious touch, the clasp delicate and familiar. He stepped forward, that too. "No," Clara whispered, her hand flying up to cover it. "Please, it was my mother's. It has no value." The man's eyes narrowed. He didn't speak again. He simply reached out his gloved fingers, surprisingly quick. He ripped the locket from her neck. The fine chain snapped, stinging her skin. For a moment, his fingers brushed her throat, a touch as cold and impersonal as a snake's scales. He held the locket in his palm, examining the simple floral engraving for a moment before closing his fist around it. A wave of violation washed over Clara, so profound it left her breathless. She looked at her father, a silent, desperate plea in her eyes. "Do something. Say something." Jonas met her gaze for a fleeting second, then looked away, his jaw tight, his shoulders hunched in a posture of complete surrender. He had watched them take her last connection to her mother and had done nothing. In that moment, something inside Clara, something she had mistaken for daughterly love, fractured beyond repair. "That's all," the leader said, his voice flat. He pocketed the locket. "Get back in the coach. Don't look back." As they scrambled back into the ransacked coach, the bandits mounted their horses. The leader paused, his cold gaze sweeping over them one last time, resting again on Clara. It felt as though he were memorizing her face. Then, with a sharp command to his men, they wheeled their horses around and galloped away, disappearing back into the shimmering heat haze from which they had come. The driver, shaken but alive, cracked his whip, and the stagecoach groaned back into motion. Inside, the silence was thick with shared terror and individual shame. The stern-faced woman wept quietly into a handkerchief. The salesman stared blankly at his empty pockets. Jonas just sat there, staring at the floor, his face a mask of sullen resentment. But Clara didn't cry. She sat rigid, her hand clutching the empty space on her neck where the locket had been. The pain of its absence was a physical ache, a cold hollow in her chest. It was more than the loss of a piece of silver. It was the theft of a memory, a final brutal severing from her past. And as the coach rattled on toward the dusty, forsaken town of Bitter Creek, a new feeling began to smolder beneath the shock and grief. It was a cold, hard anger, directed not only at the masked man who had stolen her locket, but at the father who had stood by and let him. Bitter Creek was less a town than an open wound on the face of the prairie. Its single dusty street was lined with raw, unpainted buildings that slumped against each other for support in their false fronts, a pathetic attempt at grandeur. The air hung thick with the smells of dust manure and the sour tang of cheap whiskey spilling from the swinging doors of the saloons. It was a place where hope came to die, and Clara May had been watching it die for 22 years. The robbery had left Jonas May not just poorer, but meaner. His desperation festered, turning his usual sullen silence into a volatile anger that could erupt at the slightest provocation. His general store, once the source of their meager living, was failing. The railroad had bypassed Bitter Creek, and the town was slowly bleeding out its lifeblood, draining away down the new steel tracks. Watching from the store's grimy window, Clara saw the man who ruled their dying town, Silas Blackwood. He was a land baron, a man of quiet wealth and immense influence, who had been buying up the surrounding ranches and water rights for pennies on the dollar. He was a man of stark contrasts, dressed in a fine Eastern suit that seemed immune to the Wyoming dust, yet possessing eyes as hard and unforgiving as the land itself. He moved through Bitter Creek not as a resident, but as an owner surveying his property. His presence was a constant oppressive weight on the town, a reminder of their collective failure. Today he stood outside the land office speaking with the sheriff, a portly, complacent man named Jebediah Croft. Blackwood's gestures were minimal, his voice too low to be heard, but his meaning was clear. He was in command. Sheriff Croft nodded obsequiously, his posture that of a loyal dog. Clara had tried to report the robbery to describe the leader and her stolen locket, but Croft had dismissed her with a wave of his hand. Just road agents, missy. Happens all the time. Nothing to be done. As Blackwood and the sheriff talked, a lone figure leading a pack mule emerged from the livery stable. Ethan Boone. He was a whisper in the town, a myth made flesh. The Mountain Man. He came down from his isolated homestead only a few times a year for salt flour and ammunition, his presence causing a stir every time. He was lean and weathered, his clothes practical, and worn his eyes the color of a winter sky, clear, cold, and seeing everything. He moved with a quiet self-possession that set him apart from the boisterous, desperate men of Bitter Creek. As Ethan tied his mule to the hitching post, Silas Blackwood's gaze fell upon him. The land baron's polite mask faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something cold and sharp, pure, unadulterated hatred crossed his features before being smoothed away. Ethan, for his part, seemed not to notice, or perhaps chose to ignore it. He went about his business with an economy of motion, his focus entirely on the task at hand. But Clara saw the exchange. She saw the venom in Blackwood's eyes and wondered at its source. Ethan Boone's valley was one of the few pieces of land in the county that Blackwood didn't own, a stubborn holdout in his ever-expanding empire. Perhaps it was as simple as that. The sight of Ethan so free and self-contained was a sharp contrast to her own suffocating existence. Her life was a cage built of her father's bitterness and the town's pity. Since her mother's death, she had been Jonas's unpaid servant housekeeper and shopkeeper, her own dreams shrinking until they were as small and dry as a pressed flower. Her brother Samuel had escaped 2 years ago, running off with a cattle drive, leaving her to face their father's decline alone. The bell above the store door jangled, and Jonas stomped in from the back room, his face flushed the smell of whiskey on his breath. That robbery, he growled, as if it had happened an hour ago instead of a week. Wiped us out. Wiped me out. He stared at Clara, and his gaze was not that of a father, but of an accountant tallying a bad debt. She had seen that look before, but never with such naked calculation. 22 years, he muttered more to himself than to her. 22 years of food and board. And for what, a spinster daughter, a drain on my resources. A cold dread coiled in Clara's stomach. She knew what was coming. He had threatened it before in drunken rages, but she had never truly believed him. Today was different. Today, the desperation in his eyes was a sharp, dangerous thing. He grabbed his hat. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice thick. He stalked out of the store, his steps unsteady but purposeful, heading directly across the street toward the swinging doors of the Pike Saloon. Clara watched him go, her body frozen, a silent scream trapped in her throat. She knew where he was going. She knew what he was about to do. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that her life was about to be sold for the price of a bottle. The dust of Main Street swirled like a host of angry spirits as Jonas May's voice, amplified by whiskey and desperation, boomed across the street. $20, he bellowed, his face as red as a prairie sunset. He stood on the boardwalk outside the Pike Saloon, a spectacle for the loafers and drifters who had gathered. "That's all she's worth to me. Feed her, clothe her for 22 years, and what do I get? A spinster daughter who can't even catch a husband." Clara stood frozen in the doorway of the general store, the shame of physical heat on her face. This was it. The nightmare made real. Her life reduced to a public auction. Harlan Pike, the saloon's proprietor, a greasy, corpulent man with eyes like a pig's, stepped out onto the boardwalk, wiping his meaty hands on a stained apron. "Come now, Jonas," he said, his voice slick with amusement. His eyes slid over Clara's form, making her skin crawl. $20 seems a bit steep for damaged goods. She's past her prime. What makes you think she's worth that much to me? She can cook, she can clean, and she's got all her teeth. Jonas spat the words a litany of her meager value. More than you can say for most of the women in your establishment. The crowd of rough men chuckled. Clara recognized them, cowboys, out-of-work railroad men, prospectors whose dreams had turned to dust. Not one of them met her eye. Not one of them would lift a finger. They were merely spectators at her humiliation. "I'll give you 15, Pike countered, pulling a wad of bills from his vest. "And that's being generous." 15 and a jug of that good whiskey you keep in the back," Jonas haggled, extending a trembling hand. Clara's vision blurred. This was her future, a life of drudgery and fear in the back rooms of a saloon, her worth defined as $15 and a jug of whiskey. She thought of her mother, of the silver locket that was now gone, and a wave of despair so profound it was almost peaceful washed over her. "Deal." Pike grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "Though I want to inspect the merchandise first." He started toward her, lumbering across the dusty street. The crowd parted to let him through. Clara shrank back into the shadows of the store's doorway, her body rigid with a terror that left no room for breath. He reached out a thick, sausage-like finger to lift her chin. "You'll do no such thing." The voice was low and steady, as distant thunder cutting through the jeers of the crowd. Every head turned. Ethan Boone stood at the edge of the gathering, his pack mule laden with supplies standing patiently behind him. He had seen it all. "This ain't your concern, stranger," Jonas snarled. Ethan tied his mule to the hitching post with deliberate, unhurried movements. When he turned to face them, his winter sky eyes were fixed on Jonas. "I'm Ethan Boone," he said, as if the name itself were a statement. "And I'm making it my concern. How much for the woman?" Pike bristled. "We already got a deal, mountain man. You can't match $15 and a jug." Ethan walked to his mule and untied a heavy bundle wrapped in canvas. He let it fall to the ground, and a cascade of prime beaver pelts spilled out, their dark fur gleaming in the sun. A murmur of appreciation went through the crowd. Such pelts were rare and valuable. "These will fetch $40 at the trading post," Ethan said quietly, his gaze now on Clara. "Maybe more. That's what I'm offering for her freedom." Jonas's eyes went wide with greed. $40 for her. "Not for her," Ethan corrected, his voice sharp. "For her freedom. There's a difference." Pike's hand moved toward the pistol at his hip. "Now wait just a minute." Ethan's hand dropped to his own well-worn Colt with a speed that was startling. "You got something to say, Pike?" The saloon owner's face darkened, but he was no fool. He knew the reputation of mountain men. They were a different breed, half wild, unpredictable, and deadly when crossed. He let his hand fall away. Greed won its battle in Jonas's soul. $40, you said, he asked, his eyes glued to the furs. "Tom Bridger at the trading post will give you fair value," Ethan said. "Tell him I sent you." The transaction was completed in moments. Jonas snatched the bundle of pelts, his eagerness pathetic. He didn't even look at Clara. "She's your problem now, Boone," he grunted before scurrying off toward the trading post, leaving 22 years of his daughter's life in the dust behind him. The crowd began to disperse the show over. Clara was left standing in the street, shaking, her world irrevocably altered. She looked at Ethan Boone, this stranger, who had just spent a season's work a small fortune on her behalf. He stood quietly, giving her a moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice gentle. "I've got my supplies. After this, I'm heading back to my cabin in the mountains. You're welcome to come with me, or I can stake you to stage fare to wherever you want to go. Your choice." "My choice." The words were so foreign, she could barely comprehend them. Why, she whispered, her voice hoarse. "What do you want from me?" He studied her with those unsettlingly clear eyes. "I want nothing. I've been where you are is all. Having your life decided by others. Treated like you're less than human. No one should have that power over another person. But the pelts, that was months of work." "It was," he shrugged. "I can trap more pelts. You can't get back your dignity once it's been sold." She looked around at the dusty, wretched town that had been her entire world. Where could she go? What could she do? She had nothing. No money, no skills beyond keeping a store, no family to turn to. He seemed to read her thoughts. "My place is quiet. Clean air, clean water. No one around for miles. You could stay until you figure out what comes next. I'm not the kind of man who'd expect payment." He added, his jaw tightening, a shadow of some old pain in his eyes. "I gave my word on that score long ago." She looked from the dust of Bitter Creek to the distant hazy blue of the mountains on the horizon. One was a prison she knew. The other was a terrifying, unknown freedom. She thought of Harlan Pike's yellow teeth, of the laughing crowd, of her father's casual cruelty. Then she looked at Ethan Boone, who had offered her the one thing no one else ever had. A choice. "I'll come with you." She said the words feeling strange and powerful on her tongue. To your place in the mountains. He nodded once, as if he'd expected no less. Let's get you outfitted then. Winter comes early in the high country. As they walked toward the mercantile, Clara felt the eyes of the town on her, but for the first time, she didn't care. She was walking away from Bitter Creek, toward the storm clouds gathering on the western horizon, and she was not afraid. The trail leading away from Bitter Creek was a thin, cruel scar on the land, and every step Clara took felt like a victory. The journey to the high country was an ordeal of sun-dust and muscle-aching weariness. On the second day, as they traversed a narrow canyon, the quiet was shattered by the sharp report of a rifle. A chip of rock exploded from the canyon wall, inches from Clara's head. "Get down," Ethan yelled, shoving her behind a cluster of boulders and drawing his pistol in one fluid motion. Two riders appeared on the ridge above them, silhouetted against the sky. They weren't the stagecoach robbers. They were rough-looking men, the kind who haunted the back tables of Pike's saloon. They fired again, the bullet whining over their heads. "They're trying to spook the mule, drive us back," Ethan shouted over the echoes of the gunshot. He fired a single, carefully aimed shot into the rock face near the riders. It was a warning, not an attempt to kill. The men on the ridge exchanged a look, then apparently deciding their job of intimidation was done, they spurred their horses and vanished. Who were they? Clara asked, her voice trembling as Ethan helped her to her feet. Blackwood's men, Ethan said, his face grim. He scanned the ridge, his eyes missing nothing. He doesn't like anyone living on land he considers his. This is his way of discouraging new arrivals. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. If you want to turn back, now's the time. They work for Silas Blackwood. Clara's mind reeled. The polite, well-dressed man from town employed thugs to shoot at people. Blackwood owns everything in Bitter Creek, including the men, Ethan said flatly. The sheriff won't do a thing. He looked at her again, the question hanging in the air. Clara thought of the man on the ridge of the bullet striking the rock beside her. Then she thought of her father's face as he'd sold her. No, she said, her voice firmer than she expected. I'm not going back. Something shifted in Ethan's expression, a flicker of respect. All right then, let's move. They won't try again so close to my valley. They know the terrain up there is mine. Their bond forged in the dust of Bitter Creek was tempered by this shared danger. The rest of the journey was made in a new kind of silence, one of watchful companionship. They were no longer just a rescuer and the rescued. They were allies. Life in the mountains was a harsh and beautiful catechism, teaching lessons of survival, one painful blister at a time. Clara, who had known only the confines of the store, discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. She learned to chop wood until her arms screamed to track game, to read the clouds for signs of a coming storm. The mountains stripped away the useless layers of her old life, revealing a core of resilience. Ethan was a patient teacher, his instructions sparse but precise. He taught her not with lectures, but by doing, allowing her to learn from her own mistakes. A quiet respect grew between them, blooming in the shared silence of their days. It was a partnership built on the solid bedrock of mutual need and competence. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the aroma of roasting rabbit filling the small cabin, Ethan spoke of the life he'd had before the mountains. He told her about Sarah, his Cheyenne wife, and their daughter Emma. He spoke of their laughter, their dreams, and the swift, brutal cholera epidemic that had stolen them from him. I was out hunting, he said, his voice a low rasp, his eyes fixed on the flames, as if seeing ghosts within them. By the time I got back, it was over. The townspeople, the missionaries, they said it was for the best, that a mixed-blood child would have a hard life. The bitterness in his voice was a raw, open wound. I buried them myself, right over there. He gestured with his chin toward a small, unmarked rise near the cabin. Then I turned my back on the world that could be so cruel. Clara's heart ached for him. She understood now the source of his solitude, the deep well of his pain. She reached out her hand, resting briefly on his arm. "I'm so sorry, Ethan." He nodded, accepting her solace without sentimentality. And in that moment of shared grief, his for a family lost hers, for a family that had never truly been their friendship, deepened into something more profound. Their fragile peace, however, was not to last. As summer waned, Blackwood's pressure increased. One morning, the stream that watered their valley slowed to a trickle. Ethan rode upstream and found the reason: a crudely built dam diverting the water onto Blackwood's adjacent property. It was a clear act of aggression, an attempt to choke them out. Ethan spent 2 days dismantling it, his face set in a grim mask of determination. A week later, a rider from a neighboring valley brought them news from town. Vicious rumors were spreading that the mountain man Boone had abducted Jonas May's daughter, that he was a crazed hermit holding her against her will. The lies were clearly Blackwood's work, designed to isolate them, to turn the sparse mountain community against them. "He's trying to break us," Clara said, her hands clenched into fists. "He thinks he can just erase you." "He's trying," Ethan agreed, his eyes dark with a simmering anger. "But he doesn't know who he's dealing with. Neither of us is as easily broken as he thinks." The first snows of autumn came early, dusting the peaks with white and driving Ethan to a decision. "I need to go to the county seat," he announced one morning. "Check the land registry, see what Blackwood's filed. There might be a legal way to fight him. I need to understand why he's so obsessed with this specific piece of land." He was gone for 4 days. Clara felt his absence like a missing limb. The valley seemed too quiet, the cabin too empty. She worked relentlessly, preparing for winter, her anxiety a constant low hum. When Ethan returned, he was a different man. The simmering anger had been replaced by a cold, dangerous certainty. He said nothing until they were inside the cabin, the door barred against the biting wind. He dropped a rolled-up newspaper onto the table. It was yellowed with age, dated 15 years prior. "I found this in the county archives," he said, his voice flat. He pointed to a small article on an inside page. The headline read, "Judge Boone's Ruling Ruins, Blackwood Family." Clara read the article, her blood running cold. It detailed a complex land dispute case presided over by Ethan's father, a respected circuit judge. The judge's ruling, though legally sound, had financially ruined a prominent ranching family, the Blackwoods. The article mentioned the subsequent tragedy. Marcus Blackwood, the patriarch, had taken his own life, and his wife had died of a broken heart soon after, leaving their only son, Silas, orphaned and destitute. "My father, Ethan," said, his voice hollow. He talked about that case. Said it was the hardest of his career, but the law was clear. He never knew. He never knew what happened to them afterward. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't about land. It wasn't about water rights or expanding an empire. This was about revenge. Silas Blackwood had spent 15 years rebuilding his family's fortune, all for one purpose: to destroy the legacy of the man who had ruined him. Ethan's Valley was the last piece of land his father had owned, the last vestige of the Boone family name. Blackwood didn't want to own it. He wanted to annihilate it. As if to confirm their terrible realization, they heard the sound of a lone horse outside. Pinned to their cabin door by a hunting knife was a small cloth bundle. Ethan cautiously cut it down. Inside, nestled in a bed of dry leaves, lay a familiar silver locket, its chain broken. Clara gasped, reaching for it with a trembling hand. It was her mother's locket stolen in the stagecoach robbery. The message was unmistakable. I know who you are. I know what you value. And I can take anything I want. The bandit leader, the man with the cold granite eyes, it had been Blackwood himself. The robbery hadn't been random. It had been a reconnaissance, a way for him to see his enemy's new companion up close. He was toying with them, a cat with two cornered mice. The fight for the valley had just become a fight for their lives. Winter descended like a shroud, burying the valley under a relentless siege of snow. The world shrank to the confines of the cabin, and the barn the silence broken only by the howl of the wind. Blackwood's sabotage of their supplies became critical. They rationed their food each meal, a careful calculation. The isolation was a tangible presence pressing in on them. One afternoon, while reinforcing the barn against the wind, a half-frozen timber slipped, catching Ethan's leg and opening a deep, ragged gash. It was a bad wound, but in the brutal cold, it became something worse. Within 2 days, the leg was swollen, the skin around the cut an angry, inflamed red. Fever set in. Fever. Clara fought the infection with every bit of mountain lore Ethan had taught her. She made poultices of willow bark and boiled snow for cleansing, but the fever climbed relentless and terrifying. Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness, his delirious mind wandering back to the past, calling out for Sarah and Emma. Clara refused to let him go. She sat by his side day and night, forcing broth between his cracked lips, bathing his feverish skin, and talking to him, her voice a constant, desperate anchor to the present. "You will not leave me," she whispered, her voice raw with exhaustion and fear. "We are not done yet, Ethan Boone. You will not die here." She was utterly alone, battling the elements, her own fear and the ghosts that haunted the man she had come to love. In the crucible of that long, desperate week, the last vestiges of the timid girl from Bitter Creek were burned away. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a fighter. Just as their food supplies dwindled to a dangerous low, a figure appeared through the swirling snow, half frozen and stumbling. It was her brother Samuel. He had heard the rumors in town and, consumed by guilt, had set out to find her. He had nearly died in the attempt, but he had made it. Samuel's arrival was a small miracle. While he was too weak to offer much help, his presence broke the suffocating isolation. And as he recovered, he unknowingly provided a crucial piece of information. Blackwood, he told them, had been boasting in the saloon, boasting that he had a final plan to deal with the squatters in Boone's Valley, a plan that would unfold as soon as the pass was clear enough for travel. He was planning a trap. Slowly, under Clara's unwavering care, Ethan's fever broke. His recovery was slow, but with Samuel's help they managed. The three of them, a strange and broken little family, survived the rest of the winter, bound together by the shared struggle against the mountain and the unseen enemy who waited for them below. The thaw came, and with it, a message. A trapper passing through delivered a note for Ethan. It was from the land office, a summons to the county seat to finalize the dispute over his water rights. It was a transparent lie, a lure. It was Blackwood's trap. "It's too obvious," Clara said, her voice tight with anxiety. "He wants you in town on his territory." I know, Ethan said, his face grim. He was still weak from his illness, but his eyes were clear and hard. "But if I don't go, he'll escalate. He'll send men up here. He's tired of waiting." "I'm going with you," Samuel insisted. "I owe you. I owe both of you." They rode down from the mountains, a tense, silent trio. The world seemed unnaturally bright and loud after the muffled silence of the winter. Bitter Creek was just as they remembered it, a festering sore of a town. They left their horses at the livery and walked toward the saloon where the meeting was supposedly to take place. As they stepped inside, the atmosphere was instantly wrong. The room was too quiet, the few patrons all Blackwood's men too watchful. And there, sitting at a table in the back, was Silas Blackwood. He was not alone. Sheriff Croft stood beside him, his hand resting on his gun. And tied to a chair, looking pale and terrified, was Samuel. A family reunion. Blackwood said, his voice a silken threat. How touching. The trapper's message had been for Samuel a lie about an inheritance. He had walked right into their hands. Let him go, Blackwood, Ethan said, his voice dangerously low. All in good time, Blackwood smiled, a cold, predatory expression. First, you will sign this. He slid a document across the table. A deed transferring ownership of the valley to him. Sign it, and your brother-in-law lives. Refuse, and the good sheriff here will be forced to shoot you while you are resisting arrest. A tragic but necessary end to our little dispute. Lightning cracked outside, and a sudden violent thunderstorm broke over the town. Rain hammered against the windows, and the saloon's flickering lamps cast long, dancing shadows. In the corner, a grandfather clock ticked loudly, marking the seconds. This was the secondary twist, the final piece of the puzzle. The law was not just absent. It was an active accomplice to Blackwood's evil. The sheriff, the symbol of order, was his puppet. They were completely, utterly alone. You won't get away with this, Clara said, her voice shaking but defiant. Blackwood's gaze shifted to her. Oh, I think I will, Miss May. Or should I say Mrs. Boone? You see, I own this town. I own the law. And I will have my revenge on the name of the man who destroyed my family. Ethan looked at the deed, then at Samuel, then at Clara. He was trapped. He could not fight his way out, not against these odds, not with Samuel's life on the line. But Clara saw something he didn't. In his monologuing, Blackwood had turned slightly, his attention focused on Ethan. And behind him on the wall hung a large, ornate mirror, a relic from the saloon's more prosperous days. In it, she could see the reflection of one of Blackwood's thugs standing near the back door, nervously fingering his pistol. She caught Ethan's eye, flicking her gaze meaningfully toward the mirror. He understood instantly. It was a desperate chance, but it was the only one they had. All right, Blackwood, Ethan said, picking up the pen. He leaned over the table as if to sign, his body shielding his next move from view. In that same instant, Clara screamed and threw the nearest whiskey bottle. It didn't hit anyone, but it shattered against the wall, a sudden jarring explosion of sound and glass. Every head, including Blackwood's, turned toward the noise for a split second. It was all the time Ethan needed. Instead of signing the deed, his hand shot out, grabbing a heavy glass inkwell from the table. He hurled it not at Blackwood, but at the mirror. The mirror exploded in a shower of silvered shards. The thug standing near the back door, startled by the flying glass, instinctively raised his hands to his face, his pistol forgotten. And in that moment of chaos, Ethan launched himself across the table, not at Blackwood, but at the sheriff. He slammed into Croft, sending them both crashing to the floor. The sheriff's gun went skittering across the room. Clara, acting on pure instinct, dove for the gun. At the same time, Samuel, seeing his chance, kicked his chair backward with all his might, toppling over and knocking into Blackwood's legs. The saloon erupted into a brawl. But the tide had turned. With the sheriff down and Blackwood off balance, the element of surprise was theirs. Clara came up with the sheriff's pistol, leveling it at the thug by the door. "Don't move!" she yelled, her voice ringing with newfound authority. Ethan subdued the struggling sheriff, then turned to face Blackwood, who was scrambling to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The grandfather clock began to chime its deep, resonant bongs, counting out the seconds of Blackwood's defeat. The storm raged outside, a fitting soundtrack to the violent end of a 15-year vendetta. The aftermath was swift. The sound of the struggle and the shattering mirror had drawn a crowd. When the townspeople peered into the saloon, they saw not a heroic sheriff and a villainous mountain man, but a corrupt lawman, being held at bay by Ethan Boone, and the town's powerful benefactor Silas Blackwood being held at gunpoint by Jonas May's supposedly timid daughter. The truth, once revealed, was like a dam breaking. One of Blackwood's men, seeing the tables turned, confessed everything in exchange for leniency. The story of Blackwood's long-simmering revenge, of his manipulation and intimidation, of the sheriff's complicity, spilled out into the saloon's smoky air. The town, which had lived under Blackwood's thumb for so long, finally turned on him. Blackwood and Sheriff Croft were taken into custody to be held for the federal marshal who was due to pass through in a week's time. As they were led away, Blackwood's cold, hateful eyes found Clara's. "This isn't over," he hissed. But it was. The power he had built on fear and secrets had crumbled to dust. In the quiet that followed, Jonas May pushed his way through the crowd. He stood before his daughter, his face a mixture of shame, awe, and confusion. He looked at the gun in her hand, at the determined set of her jaw. He saw not the girl he had tried to sell, but a formidable woman he didn't recognize. "Clara," he stammered, "I'm sorry." The apology was hollow, born of fear and public humiliation, not true remorse. But Clara nodded, accepting it for what it was. "Goodbye, Father," she said. And in those two words, she closed the final chapter of her old life. They spent one more night in town, watching as the community began to hesitantly reclaim itself. The next morning, weary but victorious, Clara, Ethan, and Samuel prepared to return to the mountains. Their valley, once a target of vengeance, was now truly and freely theirs. As they rode out of Bitter Creek, Clara didn't look back. Her home was ahead of her in the high country, with the man she had chosen and the future they would build together. Months later, under a sky the color of a robin's egg, Clara and Ethan were married in their valley. The ceremony was small, attended only by the mountain families who had become their community. They stood on the small rise where Ethan's first family was buried, making their vows not just to each other, but to the past and the future. After the ceremony, Clara walked to the two simple, unmarked stone graves. From her pocket she took the silver locket. Blackwood's men had returned it to her after his arrest. For months she had kept it, unsure what it meant to her anymore. It was a link to her mother, but also a symbol of trauma and loss. She looked at the grave of Sarah Walking Cloud, and the woman whose memory had inadvertently saved her, the woman whose legacy of strength and compassion had shaped the man Clara now loved. With a quiet reverence, Clara gently placed the locket on the weathered stone. It was an act of letting go of her own painful past and of the ghost that stood between her and Ethan. It was an offering of peace, a symbol that their new life would honor all that had come before, but would not be imprisoned by it. Ethan came and stood beside her, his hand finding hers. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. "Yes," she said, her heart full. "It belongs here now, with the women who taught us how to be strong." As they stood there, a rider approached from the lower trail. It was a boy from a neighboring homestead, carrying a letter. It was from Samuel. He had taken a job on a ranch far to the south, determined to make an honest life for himself. Tucked inside the letter was a small pouch containing his first month's wages. A wedding gift. His letter read, "For the school you're going to build. The mountains need more people like you." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she read the words. It was the final surprising piece of their new beginning. Atonement, hope, A future founded not on mere survival, but on the promise of building something better. She leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder, looking out over their valley. The stream ran clear and full. The meadows were lush with summer grass. The cabin, their home, stood solid and welcoming. The scars of the past year were still there on the land, on their bodies, in their hearts. But they were no longer wounds. They were reminders of what they had endured and what they had built in its place. They were ready for whatever came next together.